Hello, everyone, and you're very welcome to today's Irish Landscape Institute webinar. I'm delighted to introduce to you today's speaker, who is John Stack. John is a Chartered Engineer and Senior Executive Engineer in Dublin City Council. He currently oversees the Water Framework Directive section of the Protection of Water Bodies Office and is tasked with delivering projects aimed at complying with Water Framework Directive. His primary focus is on Water Framework Directive compliance and has particular interest in the use of nature-based solutions to achieve a variety of objectives, including stormwater management, water quality improvement, ecological enhancement, and for the development of social, recreational, and amenity assets. John's qualifications include 2 master's degrees, one in civil and environmental engineering and second in environmental science. John has over 20 years of experience working in the area of environmental protection, with the majority of that time working in DCC's water pollution control section. John has been working on Water Framework Directive objectives since 2008 and has been a key advocate in the establishment of the Water Framework Directive Office in Dublin City Council, which was established in 2017. So just can I ask everyone to keep their microphones off and have their name displayed on screen if they want to get the CPD points. And if you wish to ask questions, please put them into the chat and I'll ask them at the end. So without further ado, over to you, John, please.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for asking me to speak in the first place. I think it's a great opportunity to have a conversation around this type of work. So just again, by way of introduction, I work in the Protection of Water Bodies Office in Dublin City Council, and particularly working in the area of EU Water Framework Directive and green infrastructure. So today I'm really telling a story about how I ended up retrofitting SUDS at Macaulay Park in the north of the city. So questions like why there and why not somewhere else? What factors did I consider in choosing Macaulay Park? Well, to answer that, I need to look at the whole river catchment and understand what's going on in it. And that starts with the concept of Integrated Catchment Management, or ICM. So ICM is about understanding our water bodies in their entirety, identifying pollution sources, their pathways, and their receptors, and then ensuring that measures to tackle these are used appropriately and in the right location. Community engagement is essential, as is a multidisciplinary approach. So I am an engineer with a bit of a science background, so I can't claim to be the authority on absolutely everything that happens in river catchment, and that's why I really advise and advocate for the multidisciplinary aspect of all of this. So integrated catchment management, it acknowledges that for programs and plans to be effective, they must occur at the appropriate geographical scale, and in this instance, a river catchment. So it takes a broader, more holistic look at how we use land. It recognises the interconnectedness between different environmental objectives and how they support and depend on each other. So river restoration can help with habitat creation, for example. So it's broader than just the Water Framework Directive, and it includes other environmental legislation. Ultimately, it recognises that the health of the river is a measure of the health of the wider surrounding landscape. It's also cognizant of the wider and bigger social, economic and political issues facing the country. And then finally and critically, it recognises the need to involve and support communities in reaching an agreed and sustainable land and water resource management vision. It is a process. You start with preliminary screening, you characterise your river, you further characterise the river by getting the data that you need to make decisions. Then you come up with solutions and then you monitor the performance of those solutions. That effectively is the integrated catchment management approach. But we're here today to talk about solutions, in particular the use of nature-based solutions in urban catchments. And before we talk about solutions and nature-based solutions, I think it's always important to look at some concepts and definitions. I think we have to have a common language in this area. And I would start by acknowledging the importance of our green infrastructure and what it provides to us, namely ecosystem services such as clean air, clean water, pollinators, food, and so on, as well as providing habitat and all of those aspects too. I think we should view our green infrastructure the same way we view our grey infrastructure. Our grey infrastructure provides us with services, our green infrastructure provides us with ecosystem services. So nature-based solutions are really about restoring and preserving our overall green infrastructure. And the premise of nature-based solutions is that by restoring natural and modified ecosystems, you can address some of the many societal challenges that we face today, particularly those related to climate change. They're not a single action, but lots of different things working in unison. Nature-based water retention measures, again, the emphasis on this is building up our green infrastructure. What's clear from the diagram on our right here is that no one aspect of our environment is standalone. All elements of our environment, as well as our endeavours to protect them, are all interconnected. And finally, we get to SUDS, or Sustainable Urban Drainage Systems. These objectives in this slide are from Charlesworth et al., and they really cover the essence of SUDS and nature-based solutions. SUDS needs to be about more than water quality and quantity. I think the bottom two are often overlooked when we talk about SUDS. I think we often get pigeonholed into small individual SUDS elements and often lose the bigger picture of what SUDS is trying to achieve. So I think it's important to have a bigger, more strategic picture in mind with this. I'm putting on my engineering hat here for a second, just to describe what we're trying to achieve with SUDS. This is a hydrograph, and it shows the relationship between rainfall event and the response of the receiving network or water body or catchment. So it rains, flow in the network or the water body increases to a peak, and then later on it recedes. In our urban catchments, while this is happening, we often end up with flooding. And the objective for SUDS then is to try and flatten the peak of this hydrograph, preferably down to what's known as the through flow level. And the through flow level effectively is the urban runoff that would flow through our pipes, flow through our culverts and our water bodies without causing flooding. And that's, from a quantity point of view, the ultimate aim of SUDS. Again, SUDS can be applied at different scales, from source control, which could be a green roof on a single building, to site control, which could be a residential estate or an industrial site, to regional control, which comes right back to the idea of integrated catchment management, where you're looking at the entire river catchment. So the remainder of this presentation will look at the implementation of SUDS, and I'll start with regional control and work all my way down to site control, or source control, sorry. And Macaulay Park is an example of site control. So the conversation starts with the River Santry, which is about 13 kilometres in length, and it flows across the north of the city. Approximately half of the river is in Fingal County Council's area, and the other half then is in Dublin City Council's area. There's a lot going on in this catchment. There are myriad pressures on the river. Some of them are environmental and some of them are societal. Environmentally, we have poor water quality, we have flooding, which is mostly pluvial. The river is heavily altered. We have habitat loss and invasive species. The river itself then is a pressure on the North Bull Island, which has numerous designations, including SAC, SPA, proposed NHA. It's a Ramsar site and it's part of the Dublin Bay biosphere. It's an internationally significant bird sanctuary and one of the few sources of eelgrass on the east coast, which is an important food source for migratory birds. Then socially, we have low quality urban green spaces with many areas of the river catchment closed off to the public. Where we do have green space, it's mostly used for playing pitches, although some are also Brent geese feeding grounds. And then finally, it's difficult to travel from one green space to another in a safe and sustainable way. Essentially, it's a car-dependent catchment. We've done baseline archaeological assessment, and it's staggering how much archaeology and heritage there is in the catchment. So what are we doing with all this information? We have a plan for the river catchment, the Santry River Restoration and Greenway Project, and our objectives are as listed here: achieving good status under Water Framework Directive, mitigating flooding, maximising biodiversity and ecology, and then providing for the needs of people living in the catchment. So applying the integrated catchment management approach, the first thing we did was carry out a local catchment assessment, which is effectively a study into what's impacting the river. And once we've that done, we've accomplished several other studies to support the information gleaned in the LCA. One of the most interesting studies was the fish habitat assessment carried out by Inland Fisheries Ireland. We were trying to understand the barriers to supporting a fish population in the river, as there is historic records of people fishing in there. I had always understood that to mean recreational fishing for pinkeens and using nets and that type of thing. However, we observed trout, stickleback and eel in the river, which certainly fills us with joy and optimism about the future potential for this catchment anyway. And where we're at now is we're at the early stage of what effectively is an urban regeneration scheme encompassing the river from source to sea. We want the people to be able to enjoy the river. We want to provide for ecology as well. And this was developed with significant community engagement. And it's still early days with this. So just to put a bit of vision to what we're trying to achieve, here are some concepts. We've developed some photo montages. So these images compare the existing situation with the potential option from our proposals. So the top images show the existing situation and the bottom images show our potential alternative. So on the top left, we have Adair Road, which is adjacent to the Stardust Memorial Park. It's a very wide road, and in previous years, measures have had to be taken to regulate speed and antisocial behaviour in that street. It's also because it's so wide, it generates considerable urban runoff, which discharges into the Santry River, which is in Stardust Memorial Park. So our vision here is to extend the park out into the road and narrow the road, and that will help with traffic calming. That then gives us space for our greenway, and then we can use vegetation and green infrastructure and SUDS to intercept the runoff before it discharges into the river. In the middle image here, you've got the range in Coolock, and the river is culverted here for a distance of about 90 metres under the car park. We would like to reclaim that and open it up as a daylighted river culvert that is accessible to people in the area. This is interesting because the junction downstream from this is extremely complex and dangerous, but if we can do this, we would actually result in a much safer junction for active travel. And then finally, on the right, we have an open green space down near Raheny Village. This space here is generally quite wet and unsuitable for much use. There's a stormwater sewer flowing through it, bringing urban runoff into the river. And again, we can use that land to intercept that runoff and also create a wetland area for people to enjoy. Again, we have other examples here. The one on the top left is a concrete channel. It's downstream of Cadbury's in Coolock. So what's interesting here is my former line manager, as far as I understand, actually built this, and now I want to take it out several decades later. But again, it serves a function for flooding, but it has almost no ecology within it. So again, we would like to remove that concrete culvert and create a space for nature and people. The middle image is something similar, and then the final image on the right is Main Street, Raheny, which isn't directly connected to the river as such, even though the river flows through it, but there's a very significant quantity of hard-standing space in that village. So while this is prioritizing the greenway aspect of the design, intercepting urban runoff using SUDS will be a critical part of this as well. And it's important to understand what SUDS structures are supposed to do. All the images so far have shown the nice sunny weather where people are able to interact with the river. But ultimately, our interventions here have a job to do, which is to reconnect that river to a floodplain and allow that floodplain to store water and prevent flooding of properties downstream. Okay, so I've talked about river restoration, and it's a wonderful concept, but on its own, it's not enough to achieve the objectives we've set for that catchment. There's more work to be done than that. There are approximately 60 inflows into the river, all of them bringing urban runoff from various estates, both residential and industrial, throughout the catchment. So we need to address that poor water quality, as the water quality that's generated from urban runoff impacting in the river. And then we also need to mitigate flood risk by detaining and slowing the movement of stormwater. So I said earlier that most of the flood risk in the catchment is pluvial. The river only floods at one location or two locations within the catchment, but we get a lot of spot flooding and localized flooding elsewhere in the catchment. That's simply as a result of stormwater not being able to drain away quickly enough. It's not reasonable or feasible to store all of that water within that floodplain that we're trying to create. So it's necessary for us to find spots throughout the catchment where we can temporarily slow and intercept urban runoff. And that brings us to rainscapes. So while the river restoration scheme is our regional scale of project, we're now looking at a site scale here, which is your typical housing estate in the city. So Rainscapes is a SUDS retrofit scheme. It's based on the hydrology of that specific catchment. We've used the 1 in 100 year design storm for flood control. And then from a water quality point of view, our objective is to intercept what is known as the first flush, which is the first maybe 10 or 15 minutes of a rainfall event. If we can intercept all of that water, we will probably remove the majority of pollutants entering into the river via that pipe. And that is how I ended up in Macaulay Park, or Macaulay Riv as I call it. The site comprises Macaulay Road, Riv Road, and Lean Road. And within that, there are 2 large-ish urban green spaces and 5 cul-de-sacs. And what we've gone and done is retrofitted rain gardens, swales, permeable paving, and tree trenches. Macaulay Park is now nearing completion, thankfully. What's also useful about this is it has a very simple drainage network. There are 2 stormwater sewers in this catchment. There's nothing draining into them from outside the catchment, so it's easy for us to put in monitoring equipment and study the performance of our intervention and show just how it worked. So again, I like the idea of photo montages, so we developed these so that we could go out to communities and show them exactly what it is we're trying to achieve. I don't think there's much point in bringing technical drawings out to community engagement because they don't understand them and they shouldn't be expected to understand them either. But if you show them visuals, they can have a conversation. Again, these are at street level of what we were trying to achieve. And just to give it a little bit of context, this is one of the biggest cul-de-sacs in the scheme. It's about 20 meters wide and 60 meters long, approximately. And it is entirely concrete and tar macadam. There's random parking of cars. We get a lot of complaints from residents here about just the haphazard nature of parking, etc., because there's space to do it. And we would hope that it would end up looking something a bit like this when we're finished. Through consultation with stakeholders, we agreed not to reduce the number of parking spaces they were theoretically able to have post-construction. So we've retained that. They can still park their own cars there, but we would hope to deter outsiders, we'll say, from using this as a day park for themselves heading into town. We started construction last October. These images here show the excavation of the swales around Macaulay Park. And then you can see the introduction of some weirs as well to help slow the flow. What we don't want is to just create a channel that water flows through rapidly and then back into the river. We need to slow it down and retain it and allow some of it to soak into the ground and some of it to be taken up by plants. I thought it was a useful exercise to show the landscape drawings alongside the post-construction photos. I've essentially been tracing the progress of this scheme since day one in this way. So this is one of our completed swales in one of the cul-de-sacs, and the Santry River it's off to the right there behind that Jeep. But again, you can see from our landscape design how the drawings are now reflected by what you see on the ground. You can see the tree planting, you can see the boulders, there are play features, and you can see the depression that creates the swale for this. Site. And then this is more of a soft engineering one. This is the Macaulay Park. Again, you can see the delineation of the swale. It hasn't seeded yet. We had to use some turf for this under the informal play features. We had hoped the grass would grow much faster, but as a result of our very dry spring and summer, the grass hasn't grown as quickly as we hoped it would. And then this is one of the most complex aspects of the whole scheme. Again, this is that wide cul-de-sac that I mentioned earlier, the 20-meter by 60-meter cul-de-sac. There was an interesting conversation with residents here in that they didn't want this structure, they just wanted more parking bays. But I argued that if I did that, I would be sending a direct message to people that this is public parking space for anybody to use. So instead, we went and created a place for recreation and for social gathering by the people living in this estate. And I think it has worked out very well, bearing in mind that we were still able to retain the parking spaces that residents needed themselves. And then finally, you have the long linear park on Lean Road. So you can observe the footpath, the swale, some of the play features, and the various weirs. This has a long cascading series of weirs all the way down the road. And by far, it'll be the most dramatic and aesthetically pleasing element of the whole scheme when it's completed. And now that we're getting towards the end of our project, it's a good time to look at some before and after pictures. And while these look great and everything, what's more important is that residents, including the people who were skeptical initially, they're now thrilled by how this has turned out. Despite us bringing out photo montages and having lengthy discussions with them, lots of people, they still couldn't understand what it was going to look like. So there was still some skepticism and nervousness, we'll say. But now that it's there, they've been overwhelmingly thrilled by this. Again, this is another green space. We've taken what was just tar macadam. Now, actually, it's likely 30 or 40 years ago, these were green spaces as well, but were infilled for easy maintenance or something like that some time ago. But we've now turned them into a much more usable, greener space. Again, all of these parking bays are porous pavement, so any rainfall that flows onto or into them drains down underneath this into a French drain system where it's purified, and then it can discharge into the Santry River, which is at the background of this picture. Again, this is a big intervention in a cul-de-sac. You can see where there used to be lots of tar macadam, we've reclaimed that for this swale. Again, you can see we've planted extra trees in here, and we've put in some informal play features and boulders, etc., for the aesthetics. This, as I said, when these are dry, they should be perfectly available to people to use. So that's part of our design philosophy with this. And then finally, we're back to that big cul-de-sac that I showed earlier on, the 20-meter by 60-meter one. Again, I think the transformation here has been significant even from an urban design perspective. Yes, we know it will do all of the SUDS purposes, but it actually looked really, really well, or at least that's my opinion anyway. And one resident last week commented, "This is brilliant. We never get anything like this around here." But my vision is to just literally go from estate to estate throughout the entire catchment with this type of intervention over the coming years. And then finally, the long linear park is now starting to take shape. This photograph is taken about halfway along it. I was trying to capture the boardwalks and the various weirs, etc. Again, we're still just waiting for growth to pick up for the trees or for the grass. It has rapidly increased the rate of growth over the last 2 weeks, so I'm hopeful that in the next couple of weeks this will look vibrant and green. And then just to put some stats on all of this, it's all well and good going out and doing a design, but it has to do something. So the study area, the catchment area, was about 2.6 hectares, and of that we needed about 0.4 for SUDS. Much of it is in the existing green spaces, but a lot of it is also in the various cul-de-sacs that I mentioned. There were significant earthworks. We redistributed nearly 4,000 cubic meters of soil around the site, and just over 5,000 had to be removed from site. Now, some of that has been reused on other sites that the parks are using or are developing around the city. We planted over 70 trees, several hundred suitably selected shrubs. For SUDS installations like tree trenches and rain gardens and stuff, the plants you pick have to be able to tolerate what is quite a harsh environment. That environment will range from inundated to drought. So the plants you pick have to be carefully picked. And that we were very cognizant of that. And then finally, we've planted over 1,000 square meters of wildflower meadow around various swales as a biodiversity intervention. We had intensive and ongoing community engagement, and that's still ongoing. We made adjustments to this as we went along through, conversations with people asking for different things. Where it was reasonable for us to do that, we did it. And then the real performance indicator, in a 1 in 100 year storm event, we have about 400,000 litres of temporary storage in our interventions. And that's 400,000 litres of water that won't flood somebody's house or will reduce the load on the river that creates a flood risk further downstream. So when I look at all of the individual interventions, the average reduction in flow to the river from each structure is about 76%, and the range is 32% to 100%. And what that means is the quantity of water that flows into any one structure, and that could be anything from the swales to an individual rain garden, it ranges from 32% to 100% reduction. And then finally, so Macaulay Park was the site control that I mentioned. But then moving on briefly to source control, there's an awful lot that individual site owners can do to contribute to this type of work. So while I'm retrofitting SUDS into residential areas, there's an awful lot of land that's privately owned and in which I have no jurisdiction to do anything. Now, if these sites are brought forward for development, planning conditions will require SUDS. And I have seen a significant uptick in the quality of proposals from some developers in recent times, but I think there's still a lot of work to be done on this whole area. But then what happens to sites that are not brought forward for development? There's scope for retrofitting in these. And these photos are just 2 demonstration schemes that I was able to do in schools. One in Edenmore, which is near the River Santry, and the other one, the second one on the right here, was in Drimna. And while we were doing these, we were able to add to the education of children about this whole field as well. And then there's this. In the local authority, all of our work, our project work anyway, it must align with various legislative and policy objectives. But we have to recognise that we want people to be able to enjoy living in the city as well. And that brings up the idea of placemaking, which prioritises people over infrastructure. And infrastructure must work for the people. So it's difficult to deliver a plan that doesn't advance Dublin City Council's objectives. And by our objectives, I mean what's in our development plan or what's in various action plans that we're all signed up to. And they really drive the work we're doing. And then the trick is to try and maximize how we can make our city work for people living in it and give them as much enjoyment out of it as possible. I don't think it's a good idea to deliver a plan that doesn't benefit people the way we want to. And then finally, this is a photograph I took many years ago. I can't remember if I took it in Wexford or Clare, but it's a crannog. And it just reminds us that we've been dependent on and integrated with water or our aquatic environment for thousands of years. We need to respect that so that it serves our future generations. And that was my final slide. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
John, thanks a million. It's great to see real life examples, I suppose, of what I think we aspire, a lot of design aspires to. So if anyone wants to ask a question, they could just pop it in the chat there and I'll put it to John. But John, in terms of area required for retrofitting, you put up the area of Macaulay Park there, but I wonder, in general, are we given enough area in new developments to SUDS? Like, is it actually achievable under the current site configurations, the minimums, especially considering that SUDS and open space normally have to work off at the same percentage of site?
To say, are we giving it enough depends on what you're trying to achieve. If you are focused only on water quality and quantity, you don't need a massive amount of space for SUDS, or certainly you don't need as much as people think you need. For a lot of the time, for many years, there was resistance to SUDS because people said it took up so much space. But if you're looking to control the flow of water and clean it, you actually don't need a massive amount of space. And there's a lot of research and innovation coming out now in the use of small bump outs on streets. So I think if we're trying to protect our green space for other purposes, what we do in our streetscape, you know, our like those cul-de-sacs, for instance, we can do an awful lot in those that doesn't sacrifice our open green spaces. But then I would also say that when it's dry, our green spaces should be 100% available for those other uses, be that ecological or recreational or social, etc.
Thanks. Another question then on water quality. You mentioned the plain pitches, and I wonder is you probably don't have much rural hinterland in that catchment, but does the fertilizing of grass in urban green spaces that create a problem for urban rivers?
Well, it certainly can, and I know phosphorus and nitrates are elevated in the Santry River. So while there's no, so nitrate doesn't have a Water Framework Directive limit in rivers. It does in the coast. Phosphorus certainly does. But we know that there are elevated phosphorus and nitrogen levels in the Santry River. And yes, the application of fertilizer, certainly if it's done incorrectly, could have an impact on that. I don't think we're at the stage where we're able to pick apart the sources to that level of detail. Effectively, we have urban runoff, which can be through pipes or overland, and we have the foul sewer network. That's as far as we can go with quantifying what comes from where at the moment.
Okay, thanks for that. Question then from Mike Vogel. Is the council maintenance team fully on board with your proposals or your interventions, I should say, at this stage? And did you have to make concessions to accommodate them?
My office, the Protection of Water Bodies office, has a surface water management team, and we are going to maintain SUD structures ourselves into the future. So there is a bit of a tie over. Where does the SUD structure end and where does the open parkland begin? Because in fairness, our parks department are the people who cut all the grass, etc. So there will be a relationship between them and us. But by and large, we will maintain the SUD structures themselves, and then the traditional grass cutting aspect will remain with the parks department.
Question then from Lucy Carey. Is it acceptable for permeable parking to drain directly into the ground rather than into the stormwater system?
That's a good question, but it depends on your soil permeability. If you have good soil permeability, it is better to let your water soak into the ground. What's really interesting about permeable paving is it has a huge capacity to remove sediment out of the water column. Many of the pollutants bind to sediment. So while we all look at our tree pits and our rain gardens and look at all the lush vegetation and go, they must be doing tremendous work to clean water, porous surfaces also do a tremendous amount of work to clean water. If you don't have the permeability to soak it into the ground, well, then it needs to discharge back into a sewer network or into receiving water. But you can do that in the confidence that it's clean.
Very good. And can I ask then what the soil types generally were in the Macaulay Park project?
I think this probably speaks for most of the city. While the city is built on boulder clay, that's quite deep. We have an awful lot of made ground.
Oh, yeah.
And the majority of the lands in the Macaulay site was made ground. So it has some permeability, but it's not your it doesn't have high levels of permeability. So actually several of our structures in this site are actually lined because we know there isn't the permeability to let it soak into the ground. Our objective is to clean it and let it discharge back into the river cleaned. So yeah, mostly made ground.
And what would you use as a liner then?
A tarpaulin, it's a plastic tarpaulin, currently plastic. But I suppose I know in wetland design, there's often the concept of an anthracite liner. Those are extremely expensive, but they're perhaps unnecessary for this type of work. An anthracite liner would be done on a very large scale. You'd be talking wetlands that are a few thousand square meters. We don't have the space for that. So you're relying on plastic liners.
Question then from Oliver Hoey. The weirs are a great way of creating bioretention areas along linear swales. What are they constructed from?
We spend a bit of time thinking about this. We would like to have used Irish oak for these, but we were advised to use composite plastic, I'm afraid. Not the best sort of product that we would have liked, but in terms of longevity and resistance to antisocial behavior and damage, we had to go with the composite plastic.
A question then from SP Carroll. Do you have an opinion on current government Department of Housing plans to see 466 stretches of river, lakes and estuaries classified as heavily modified water bodies, and how this might affect future restoration of riparian environments / SUDS and nature-based solution provision?
Right, well, that question goes beyond this talk. I need to read all of those that document. I've heard about this in the media. I haven't had a chance to read it, so I don't
Yeah,
want to comment any further on it.
it's I suppose the question is maybe underplaying the extent of it. It says 466, but some of those stretches of rivers are absolutely enormous.
Yeah,
So it's a lot of water bodies, and I think while the heavily modified status kind of, you still have to get the ecological bang, so you do have
you do,
to
yeah.
still clean the water and provide for biological. You do not have to restore the character of the river. That's
Yeah,
the
but
big.
you also can't just turn around and say it is heavily modified. Um,
Well, well, I think the key thing is that the OPW are proposing that every single arterial drainage scheme is to be placed in that classification, which obviously is a lot of the country.
yeah,
Uh,
but it's not that straightforward. What constitutes a heavily modified water body is defined. So again, I'm not too up to speed on this at the moment, so I won't talk too much about it, but you can't just decide it's heavily modified. There has to be a certain length of artificial channel. There has to be a certain number of impoundments and abstractions and so on and so forth. It's not a straightforward decision.
okay. I suppose in terms of your team, John, if you could, your multidisciplinary team, you might be able to outline for us which professions are involved in the Macaulay Park project, please.
So there's two teams in this. There's the DCC team, and then there's the consultants who designed it. In DCC, in my office, there's engineers, there's scientists, there's technicians, and an administrative staff. So we then, because we're a small team and we don't have all the expertise, we engaged with the Parks Department for their landscape experience, the Roads Department, the Drainage Division. We talked to all of those to get their input into this. So it's a growing team as well. I would hope to get a landscape architect on the team shortly. There's rumors of that, so fingers crossed. And interestingly, a procurement specialist would be very useful on the team as well. These are complex contracts, and the whole area of contract and procurement is getting more and more difficult. So I would like that on my team as well. But then the design team, McCloy's were the primary consultant in this, and then Robert Bray were doing the landscape design as part of it. So it was as multidisciplinary as we could make it.
Right. Um, so question from Kevin McCann, can you tell us about the funding stream used for this? Such projects can sometimes attract negative press, particularly with calls for money to be spent elsewhere.
Yeah, that actually came up. I got lambasted one night that this was a total waste of money when there's a homelessness crisis and a housing crisis. But I was arguing that at the start of every year, council decides on the budget and monies are allocated to various different objectives or area or outcomes. Housing is one of them, roads is one of them, the environment is another one. This scheme is part funded by Dublin City Council through development levies, and then parts funded by the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage as part of the overall pilot project. This is a study, remember. We're trying to get information on the performance of these interventions. So that was the funding mechanism for this.
Thanks for that. I suppose in a lot of when systems, especially retrofit or wetland systems, are all joined up, they ultimately discharge to a natural water body, hopefully, or a river corridor. So, given the hydrological connection, is there concerns about plant selection? I suppose obviously you avoid known invasives, but there's always a risk that plants that would naturally occur in a catchment can be brought in, even if they maybe are native to the country generally.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Where these interventions go in, I think the natural local seed bank is probably the most important thing to look at. But I also then mentioned that, if you have a defined rain garden or a tree pit that has a curb around it, that's a very harsh environment. It's not a natural environment at all. You may need plants that are very tolerant to that environment. But by and large, when you are connecting these up, they do ultimately discharge to a watercourse. We have an invasive species issue in the sanitary catchment, which I hope will be addressed through the bigger scheme. But you do need to take measures to prevent proliferation of that. And as I said, I would be an advocate for the local seed bank being prioritized for plant selection when you're doing these schemes.
And I just in terms of constructed wetlands, that I know we haven't necessarily touched on that in this talk, but how appropriate do you think it is not to plant a constructed wetland, just to let plants colonize naturally and the succession to happen?
So if I'm doing a constructed wetland, I need to use plants that have a high rate of pollutant or nutrient uptake effectively. So, there are plants recommended for that. And again, they tend to be plants. Again, most wetlands, we had a history for many years of planting Phragmites australis in all of our wetlands. We don't do that anymore because they're a bit unsightly and they're quite pervasive. Most wetlands nowadays, the plants that I see going into them are what you would typically see on a lakeside bank or something like that. So I
Yeah,
think
so
you need to plant those. Otherwise, if you're just relying on the local vegetation to grow, is that not a swale rather than a wetland,
yeah, so you need the plants with the proven filtration performance.
Yeah.
Great. Message from Ronan, or a question from Ronan, I should say, sorry. Is there an issue of trip hazard on the curbs in the tree pits / rain gardens, especially close to car spaces, uh, and particularly for taking in charge?
Well, I'd like to think we've minimized any risk of that. I suppose in an urban city, there's trip hazards. Every curb is technically a trip hazard. We have I don't think we've done anything that's massively different from curb design in the city. And as I said, we had to comply with the roads department's construction guidelines anyway. So I don't think we've done anything different to anybody else around that.
Question from Andre on phytoremediation. So he's wondering, was it necessary for heavily polluted soils in this site? And if it wasn't, I know you've looked at this on other sites, so you might be able to just give us a quick overview on how useful that could be in an Irish context.
Well, I've used phytoremediation twice. One, I was assisting a student in his dissertation, and another one then was on an old landfill site. Phytoremediation it's a very specific approach, and if it's not done properly, it's not going to work. You need to develop a dense coppice of, for example, willow or something to treat localized pollution issues. So, for instance, I applied it at a landfill where leachate was just bubbling up out of the ground and flowing down a hill towards a river. We planted a dense coppice in that perhaps 10 years ago, and I pass it quite frequently, and it seems to be doing very well at the moment. Even that wasn't correctly planted. If I remember correctly, for a coppice, you need about 5 plants per square meter. And it's not natural either, if you think about it. And then a coppice has to be managed every decade or so. It's going to have to be thinned out to let new growth happen, so that even more pollutants are uptaken into it.
So I suppose the main takeaway is it's a very specialized thing, and you would want to get specialized designers on board for any project that requires phytoremediation.
You would, and again, context is really important. Again, it can work as sort of a woodland type thing, but for that you're looking at scale. So, and then I suppose the other side of it is when you harvest the coppice every so often, you now have a resource. You know, that wood can be used for things. But yes, the design of it is specialized.
Right. There is a question for me then from Kat, which is about keeping a track of CPD points for the Institute. So the answer to that, Kat, for the moment is just to keep a log yourself for the moment. We are looking at IT solutions for a centralized system where you can upload your log to an Irish Landscape Institute database. But for the moment, if you could just keep a log yourself, just a simple Excel sheet would be perfect, just to say what you've done and when. So I think that is all the questions. So we're more or less on time. So I'd just like to say a very big thank you to John. Again, fantastic to see this kind of work being rolled out in Dublin. Hopefully we're going to see a lot more of it in the near future, not just in Dublin. And thank you to Hazel for organising today's webinar. So thanks so much, John, and we'll see everyone again at our next CPD event.
You're very welcome.